pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Now we'll go with the roll call.
Laura Blakely, Ellen Wheeler,
Devin Conley,
Jose Gutierrez Jr.
And Tamara Wilson. Let the record reflect that all 5 trustees are present. Can I get an approval of the agenda, please?
so moved.
Second.
Okay, on a motion moved by trustee Wheeler and seconded by trustee Gutierrez, the approval of the agenda passes. And now is the opportunity for members of the public to address
Do
the
we need to
board.
vote on it?
Oh, so all those in favor? My apologies.
aye.
Aye.
Too much coffee. So now we'll move on to item 3, which is 2, the opportunity for members of the public to address the board concerning items on the closed session agenda. Are there any members of the public who'd like to address the board at this time? Okay, seeing as there are none, at 6:05, we will recess to closed session. Thank you.
And you get a breather.
risk, even if you did put in a specialized, signal just for that purpose. Have you seen anyone who's tried to
I haven't
put
seen it.
numbers on these things?
Not seen it. Good idea. Something should be done.
It's like, oh, well, we have a garden adjacent, or we have a garden that's down the block as part of the community. We have park adjacent, or we have nature areas, but if there's, yeah. Well, that's one of the things that's available. Or we have a great. One in America.
All right. Here we go. Make sure.
Award.
My mic's on.
Oh, what's that?
My mic's on.
Okay, mine too. All right, at 6:44, we'll re-adjourn the meeting of the Mountain View Wisman School District Board of Trustees. There was action taken in closed session. I'm going to read out this report out pertains to item 3A on the closed session agenda. In closed session by a vote of 5-0, the board exercised its right per paragraph 10 of the employment agreement with Dr. Clark to unilaterally terminate the current agreement. Dr. Clark's last day of employment with the district was today, April 25th, 2019. In accordance with applicable law, the approved settlement agreement, and the employment agreement, the district will pay Dr. Clark a 6-month severance payment. The governing board and the district sincerely thank Dr. Clark for his service and wish him well in the future. And now we'll move on to item 5, the study session on urban school design. Take it away.
All right, Randy, I guess they pointed directly to you. So this is Randy from FN&I. He works with Artique, who we have contracted to do work to really help us to create the design for an urban school model. This is a process that is supposed to take us around 20-something months. So we're not expecting to have anything, but over the last couple of days, we spent a lot of time traveling to sites. And over the last, essentially, I think 6 months or so, we've been meeting both with developers in North Bayshore, as well as biweekly meetings to just sort of talk about what is it we're trying to do, what do urban schools look like, and what things should we take into consideration. And so I think after the visits today and yesterday, as well as some of the things that F&I and Artique brought to the table, is a good time to report out and sort of get some feedback from the board. And so I'm going to turn over to Randy, who's going to take us through the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Rudolph. It was wonderful to tour schools, and some of you had a chance to attend in the last 2 days. And so we learned a lot about Mountain View Wisman and also some of the neighboring districts as well. With a big project, it's helpful to have a framework that how to think, how to make decisions, and the design thinking process is a good one to apply to this. And it always starts with listening, and a form of listening is also seeing. What do we see? What do we observe? And so some of the things we've seen in the last few days, you have some very strong principals that lead educators at several of your schools that really know how to bring out the best in their students and staff. Very important. Now, another big part of design thinking is defining the problem. And so one of the things that I've heard from Dr. Rudolph is, how do we make this work? We have this wonderful opportunity in North Bayshore. Google offering us 2.5 acres with another acre of land right next to it. And it's a lot going on there. How would we make that work? So what is that problem in terms of space, in terms of learning, in terms of land? And so tonight we're going to do a mini design cycle together, go through all of these. We'll start looking at defining and listening what we've seen, and we'll look at some big ideas. What are some of those big ideas that are impacting education that we see around the world? A little background, I've known Bill Gould of Artique for a couple of decades, and we've been colleagues. And during that time, my firm, Fielding Nair, has worked in 50 countries. And so we've had a chance to really see what's happening around the world. What's the best in learning ideas? So we're going to share some of that. Part of that context will be the global learning context. And we're going to consider a little different paradigm, and that is being more closely connected. So I'll give you some diagrams and share with you some ideas about what does that mean in a big context, being closely connected. A smaller site and a smaller footprint can actually support the highest quality of education. We'll see a 5-minute video of Singapore American School. That's one of our projects, and you're going to see a lot of density, but also how successful the learning is there. Creative approach to use of parks and rooftops, something we've seen in our tours when we were in San Francisco yesterday. We'll show you some images of that, and we'll ask for your comments, Mrs. Blakely, Mrs. Wheeler, Mrs. Conley. You saw them yourself. Connecting to the local neighborhood is so important, and around the world we see this emphasis on how do we fit not only a global network, but a local network, even at the primary level. And so here's an opportunity in North Bayshore on the site we're looking at where we're very closely connected, and that can have wonderful benefits. An increase in density is actually often associated with more connectivity and more creativity. Well, look at that. The schools we saw, you're all familiar with, from Mistral and Castro to Thurikoff, Stevenson, Landells. You see in the image of Stevenson, we're meeting with Rebecca, and she's talking about the value of experiential learning and how they're using flexible spaces. And we saw that also at Thurikoff and at Landells as well. Here's some of the schools that we saw, neighboring urban schools. Gene Parker, and also the Nueva School, Tenderloin, downtown San Francisco, Horace Mann. So some of those ideas, some of this context of, we talk about context, not only the land context, but the context of a learning framework.
I'm sorry, can you speak a little louder?
Thank you for asking, Mr. Gutierrez. Yeah, I'll keep the microphone a little bit. Is this better?
Much better,
Great.
thank you.
So we think about a network, how important a network is in businesses, how important it is in Silicon Valley, and then start thinking about that in terms of learning. If you look on the left, this is what learning used to look like. It was a very hierarchical network. Actually, it would go from the state to the board, down to the superintendent, down to the principals, and by the time you got to the students in the lower part of that diagram, they're a bit grayed out, less agency, less ability to be the heroes of their own story. But the way learning looks today is more like what we see on the right, a more open network. And not every teacher is comfortable with that. Some teachers are struggling a little bit, I think, with how much information students are getting. And yet this is what's happening, and we see it happening around the world. So being able to take advantage of that in our schools is critical. In a hierarchical network, information flows more in one direction. And in an open network, you see it going in multiple directions, like this, one of our projects in Texas. Designing for open networks and career success. So Professor Ron Burt at the University of Chicago, he's one of the top researchers on networking, found that simply being in an open network instead of a closed one is the best predictor of career success. So if you look at this school, this is outside of Toronto, you can see how the students are working with a lot of agency in different areas. It's a kind of open network school. And also, we heard from some of your principals, for example, Heidi at Landells, talking about how what's going on there now is less about lining up in rows and columns and more important about how people are connecting in smaller groups. And really, we have a different kind of schedule. It's not that cells and bells so much anymore, where you're sitting in a cell listening to a bell, but in fact, there's collaborative time, there's individual reflective time, And there's also active time where we're getting out of our chairs. Looking at, this is Norma Rose Point School, one of 4 elementary schools that we design in Vancouver, British Columbia. And you can see design for inquiry. And this is something that people resonate with everywhere. And when I was first talking to Dr. Rudolph, he talked about, he saw that value and affirmed that of designing for inquiry. And you see it again at one of our 4 elementary schools we opened in Boulder, Colorado recently. Designing for a culture of curiosity and risk-taking is important. And you see now that there's a little different look at how the learning studios or classrooms on the right are being used. There's a kind of reverse from this being a breakout space to actually a lot of the learning happening in that central commons, and then the classrooms becoming more of a breakout space. And the reason I'm sharing this is not because we've designed this school or we have an idea what it's going to look like, but as a way of part of that ideation, part of that listening and research is to share with you what we see happening around the world, to stimulate discussion with you. Fluid indoor-outdoor connections. Everywhere we went, we heard people say here in the last 3 days that the connection to outside was so important, and also a request for more shade. Just a comment here that this is on a 2nd level. This school is in Vancouver, and they're making tremendous use of actually a fairly small outdoor balcony. And then you see an outside view of that school. This is one of our projects. We have about 15 projects in China. This is in Hong Kong, where if they had the amount of square foot per student that you have, they would just go crazy. Very, very tight spaces, but the use of these outdoor spaces is tremendous. They're used constantly. One of our projects in Mumbai, formerly Bombay, this was a converted high-rise, and that's on the left, and you can see the use of that outdoor roof space. And then on the right, we're back to Vancouver. This is one of those outdoor decks. Small spaces, but are very efficiently used. A few more images, and then I'm going to pause for discussion. This idea that the context of the school is so important is a real asset. So being in a dense area, if you have a lot of strong connections, can be valuable. And in this diagram, actually, it harks back to John Dewey's work about 110 years ago. The school is a center of community. This is an update on that. But these connections to nature, to universities, to businesses, and even to home and being close to home, all of that's so important. And it impacts this study because, as you know, there was an offer for a site that was further away from where people are living. But this strong connection to where people are living is very important. It's a tremendous asset. This real-world community-connected learning. So this Center for Advanced Professional Learning is a national network where actually businesses mentor kids. It's best known at the high school level. For example, my firm in Minneapolis, we mentor a local high school in Prior Lake. Kids come in, we give them projects and mentor them. But it actually works even at the primary school level. We have schools where this is Fisher STEM Middle School in North Carolina, where industry comes into the school and works with middle school kids.
Where did you say that was? North Carolina.
That's in
North Carolina.
Greenville, yeah. So this is going a little bit far afield, but I'm going to make a connection. Where are kids going when they get out of school? And this happens to be Avenue Escazú in San Jose, Costa Rica. And the reason I put this slide up, if you look at the Texas Tech University in Costa Rica, this is one of our newest projects. It's a satellite university. What's special about it is around the world, we are hearing people say, we're looking to integrate learning at the center of our community. And so we're actually able to program a lot of the learning out in a public plaza. Now we have a lot of work to do if we were to do some of that kind of work with primary school students in terms of security and management, but it's absolutely possible, and we can give you examples of it. And I thought this image was interesting because so many of our clients and of schools of all levels are saying This is a kind of quality of life that we would aspire to, and I think what you have the potential for in North Bayshore. And so you see an image. This is actually retail at the ground floor, and then we have the university is above. And you can see in some of the renderings, this entry over on the left, the connections to the outside and to light and the public, and on the right, these connected spaces with high seating and low seating. What does an open network school look like? You see some of those examples. Not all open space. That kind of nest space at the top and the back is actually one of the most popular spaces in the school. And here you see a learning suite, connected classrooms. And I'm going to show a 5-minute video, and then I'm going to pause and ask for your comments and for just some discussion before we go on to the next part. And the value of showing this is seeing it in real life, happens to be in Singapore.
What the kids are doing right now is we're in the middle of the body system unit. We're learning about the body systems, how they interact with one another. We're getting to the part where kids are going to try to personalize the work. So we taught them about certain things that we want to know. And now the kids are going to choose a body system that they want to go deeper into. So markets for circulatory system, I believe the hospital there is going to be an expiratory system. So right now, what you probably just would have told us the kids were brainstorming a bunch of questions we wanted to know the answers to about that topic. And now the kids are starting the research, they're gathering all the information. And so what we see around here is a bunch of students who have decided to stay here in the classroom to do that individual quiet research. But the option was given to the rest of the class to go to the spot that they are most comfortable in doing this work. So we have some kids here sitting down at a table, and right around that corner to that door, we have the place where we call Circle City. Kids are out there, they're sitting on the comfy couch or on the floor or at a higher table.
Do we need to pause and let it buffer so that the video can play? There we go. Thank you.
We're getting a little lag. This is actually coming in.
So right now, we're mapping one of the 3 standards for the pathology unit. They are working on the second of the 3 standards. They're working on the first. It's just breaking apart the keyword of the standard and statement, and also taking examples of approaching and implementing version of the standard. And each of it is examples, and we mix them all up so that you can try to approaching from me.
In a traditional classroom with 4 walls, we were restricted by those 4 walls. But here, we don't just have 4 walls, but we have a bunch of walls that we work with. So we can make the space fit what we need rather than the space dictating what we can do. So right now the kids are working on consolidating some skills that they've been working on over the past several lessons. So with this particular lesson, they're working on writing equations from stories and representing those relationships in tables and graphs. So this is actually one of the biggest, most important units of the year, and I'm pretty pleased so far with how the students are showing their understanding. You're about to find out. Go! Oh yeah, that's what our average is. 29.5.
Please go up. So today's exhibit day. Big day.
Welcome, parents, speakers, staff, and guests. Thank you for coming. Throughout the past few weeks, we have been working on projects related to our ecological footprint. These topics include plastic, palm oil, water pollution, food pollution, and more. The main purpose of this exhibition is to show our actions that we have gathered with you today to reduce our ecological footprint. Please enjoy our exhibition. Thank you.
So impressed and proud by all the kids right now. The way that they're able to talk about their driving questions and the actions they took and the impact they were able to make is absolutely incredible. Like, I just can walk around with people right across my face. And like from the math teacher standpoint, the way that they've been able to use ratios and proportions and percents to get people to understand what's going on, like I'm just so happy because they see the real world applications of math. And I think that's the biggest point of doing an interdisciplinary project like this. So overall, those are my thoughts.
Thank you for listening and watching. I'd like to ask for comment at this point and questions.
I've got a comment. It was very interesting to me to see how the learning and the spaces are complementing each other. So that's one of the things I was commenting about today on the tours to Horseman and Nueva is I thought I was going to spaces, and what I was seeing was how the academic learning and the social learning was being enabled by the spaces. So that was very exciting.
So glad to hear that, Mrs. Wheeler. Yes, Mr. Gutierrez.
I'm saying hello to a teacher.
Oh.
I think what you're trying to do is basically what we have seen is happening around the Bay Area, especially trying to do more with less.
Mhm.
So in this case, I get the gist of it, and there's different conceptual ideas as to how you realize that. The table settings, the spacing around, the indoor and the outdoor, the connectivity between nature, light, and ideas and community building. I see that at PayPal. I see that at Stanford. But where they have their lab studies now and their community centers are completely different from how they were 20, 10, 15 years ago. And I'm just basically seeing that come into play now in the public schools with these examples. So I appreciate that.
Thanks for your comment, Mr. Gutierrez.
Well, I didn't get to go on any of the school tours, so I'm not even certain what you've seen and liked and examples of that. And the video was very nice, and all of these ideas are obviously wonderful. I mean, we would do everything if we had all the money in the world to do it. I not having been on that, I was hoping to kind of have a conversation or get some thoughts on what you saw and what you thought was great or what you'd like to see incorporated in our potential new site out at North Bayshore.
That makes perfect sense because I didn't go either, right?
I
If we
was
could find out from the other
unable to.
trustees what they saw visually, what was appealing to them at the different school sites, perhaps that might help start a conversation.
We do have some pictures. I think it's best if you talk about it, but if it would be helpful, I can skip to some pictures of the schools.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of my comments are probably more for once we've gotten more into the meat of the discussion and further along in the presentation.
Okay.
Agreed.
Ms. Conley. I just wanted to address your comment, Ms. Wilson, about it was great to hear you would like to do all those things if you could. That I haven't seen and worked for 30 years in 50 countries a correlation between the type of projects we're showing and budget. Not a significant one. It isn't about how much money you spend. A lot of these projects are actually smaller in terms of square footage than traditional schools. And most of those key principles that you were talking about, Mr. Gutierrez, as far as looking like new Silicon Valley businesses, have more to do with, I think, the values that you're trying to achieve in the school than the budget. It's not about using granite. It's not about having big high spaces. So if we're going in the right direction, and as we go ahead to next steps and do more programming and visioning, you want to have this type of school, I'm confident that we will be able to achieve that. And so I'll go on.
I'm just going to jump in for just a quick.
Please.
It's on.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
A quick moment. I'm not sure we've talked as a district about, totally shifting to a student-driven, project-based model. I know we're incorporating that in some of our classes, but I'm not sure the plan is that we would flip and go entirely in that model. And I'm not adverse to it, but I think I'd want direction from staff and want to make sure that we're bringing teachers along if that's the direction we're going in.
Well, and most of the examples that were presented here were older students. They weren't elementary school students in that context. So.
Yeah, I would just simply say I think that's one of the considerations that you take into account when you're building a school. So for instance, today at Horace Mann, every school, every two classrooms shared a breakout session. Whereas yesterday in San Francisco, all the rooms, you could just walk directly through all of them, right? And then and then we went to the high schools, they all had these collapsible walls. And so we saw that again later on. And I think part of this is about, as we go through this process, really trying to figure out where's the direction, because we have a new strategic plan coming up also. What is the direction that the board wants to take, and how does this new building or facility capture that direction? And so, yes, we've heard a lot about project-based learning, and we've heard a lot about these aspects. It doesn't necessarily mean that at elementary school you're going to see it. But what is important, though, is that if these are design features that you're interested in, regardless of what the direction is, these are things that have to be considered up front. If it is, and I know no one went to both on both days, right? But if the idea is that you want a more traditional elementary school, the Horace Mann model is probably, there's outdoor space, but it is a classroom with a breakout space. If you want the flexibility of having walls that collapse, what we saw at Nueva are soundproof doors that give you the option to collapse at some future point. And we have time to take that into account, but I think your feedback today will sort of steer us into really honing in on a particular model, as opposed to, really looking at the different options that exist. So I agree with you. It is early to talk about project-based learning models versus anything else. It's with so many urban school designs that exist, it will help us to sort of narrow our focus down if we can understand where the board would like to go. And if it's a, middle school, as Trustee Conley said, is you want to do the upper grades is more project-based learning, and elementary school is a little bit more traditional, then that also helps us to understand the context too.
And I'm mostly just asking the question, but one of the administrators, I think at one of the schools, I think it was in Nueva, was saying that they tried to keep things as flexible as possible. And I mean, at some point, you preserve all options and it gets ridiculous, but to the extent we could keep some flexibility without increasing the cost hugely, that might make sense. like the walls that could move to some degree. You know, the flip side of that for those that weren't there was they were saying there was nowhere to pin the art up in the kids' classrooms and show their work because it was all glass and flexible walls that the minute you move them, everything fell down. So I think, especially in elementary school context, we would want to make sure that we preserve some kind of capacity to demonstrate student work. That's part of some of the PSYOP also, is like showing work and having a lot of materials on the walls. And anyway,
I think one of the
Good point.
bigger considerations is at the San Francisco schools, we saw a lot of use of play space on rooftops. And at Horace Mann, they only had one space that was like that, and a lot more attention was driven down towards the ground floor. And so I think that's at least for the elementary school model, that is something that the board needs to sort of tackle. Do you want to see, the possibility of kids playing on the rooftops? And I think that's where we get a little bit more creative with the space. But that is an intentional design feature that the board has to weigh in on and sort of drive. Do you want to see gardens where you walk out and you're on the second floor that are sort of in those spaces? Trustee Conley and I talked about, do they have to be just blacktop, or can we make them mounds and a little bit more flexibility? And I think that's a little bit more of some of the questions that we need to answer.
So I think what's challenging here is we have not all gone to the same schools. And so that's why I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentation to kind of lay more of a found work for a shared language so that we can have a constructive conversation about it.
It sounds good. And, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to say one more thing related to, we're talking about learning, we're talking about space, but specifically what we were looking for and looking at is, how do you utilize small spaces?
Mhm.
So a lot of us are used to large elementary schools, or if we're lucky, we have a large house. So you have more flexibility, regarding what you can do. And to some extent, the smaller you get something, the more creative you need to be with your space. So I'm interested in seeing, what we can do with smaller space, smaller buildings, and a lot of it is flexibility and multiple uses of the same space. So, but yes, I think it would be helpful if we saw photographs.
So what I'll do is I'll skip from the international case studies, which do share some small spaces that you were asking about, but go right to some of our site visits, because I think you have some good references to those and can share those. So there's 10 of them. And so if I'm going too quick, let me know, or too slow, but we'll start with Landel's. And I'll ask the board members if you can comment about these as I go through them. Yeah.
Randy, real quick, I have 2 comment cards here.
Oh,
I'm
great.
not certain, given the format of this evening, if right now would be the appropriate time. I'm happy to take those if the 2 members of the public would wish to speak at this time. So the first one was from Stephen Nelson. Thank you.
Hi, I don't know how to break this up either, because there's 3 little discussion things. But anyway, one of the things I wanted to say is, the issue of context, which he said, is really important here, because if you're close to the nature area out there, that makes it easy to use. If you're close enough or have access even across a busy street with special stoplights, which you can put in as part of putting in a school, you have control over the street in front of the school according to what school bonds could be used for. You could go over to Charleston Park, which has wonderful water things. If you've ever been out there, go out and visit Charleston Park. The other thing is I wanted to say is, you really have to think about this being a paradigm shift, sort of like Kahn's emphasis on scientific revolutions. This is going to be an urban school. It's not anything like what we've seen in this district before. it might be more like the Cove School, which Ms. Strahl, the principal there, really wanted to develop those open classroom things, and we decided against it. We went to rather than classrooms that you could open up for dual teaching, we went back to saying, well, we want a building that looks like this, and if we have to give up the walls separating the two classroom that can open up and we can have shared instruction. So that's another issue. And what they found at the Cove is if you do this kind of school, you have to hire teachers or let them that want to do this kind of educational change. You can't just move any teacher in there and have it work. At the Cove, the superintendent and the principal made it very clear that they were only teachers who really wanted to get in that environment. They wanted to chafe at the bits. And I think there's enough instructors who want to do that now, that particularly as you hire new, it could be actually an advantage for hiring new teachers. How's my time doing? Okay. And later on, I'll have something about multiple story schools and how long they can last.
So it's my impression that people get one comment, they don't get multiple comments.
Right.
So Mr. Nelson?
Madam President, there's 3 discussion items in this presentation.
There are.
No,
I
this is
see-
our meeting.
I see 5A.
5A.
3, it says discussion.
5A.
I'm not
Study
clear what
session.
you're referring to, Mr. Nelson. I'm looking at the agenda.
We're looking at the agenda.
I'm looking at this. It says discussion.
Oh, that's
No,
not-
we're looking at the agenda, our traditional meeting, which has agenda and time for community comment.
You have 45 more seconds if you have an additional point about the number of stories and the duration of building success.
This is our meeting.
Is this on now? Yeah, it sounds like it. Since Ellen's running things again. Yeah, I
Ellen's not running
grew
things
up.
again.
Could you
This is
please be
universal.
quiet?
No. you should be
Gutierrez,
more
this is
respectful.
my time, not yours.
And how much time does he
So
have now?
please don't interrupt me.
So he's got like 25 seconds?
Don't interrupt me, sir.
29?
Don't interrupt me, sir. Thank you.
Don't insult us.
I'll insult you if you take my public time, Jose.
Go ahead, do it now.
I went to a school, Muir School, which is almost 90 years old now. It was built really strongly in 1926. My father graduated from that school. I graduated from that school, and it now is still an elementary school that works very well. If you build a good multi-story building that's adaptable, it can last for 90 or 100 years. As you can see in many of the older, substantially built multi-story buildings throughout the United States. If it's built flimsy, it isn't going to last. If it's built to be adaptable, it might be useful for 90 years. And don't interrupt me again, Mr. Gutierrez.
I'm sorry,
You
what?
have your time to do comments as long as you want afterwards. Don't do it during my time.
Don't insult my team.
I'll insult you personally if you interrupt me.
Do
Mr.
it
Nelson,
now.
we actually gave you the full time.
Do it now.
We gave you the full time.
I
Mr.
challenge
Nelson.
you to do it now.
I just
Okay.
you know.
Miss-
Thank you.
Mr.
We
Nelson,
have our
gave you-
next
we gave you the full
commenter,
time.
which
Yes.
would
Thank
be
you.
Bill Lambert. Please, can you hand the microphone? Thank you.
And Mr. Lambert, are you taking your badge off?
So my name is Bill Lambert. I'm a resident of the Montaloma neighborhood. I want to encourage you to maybe think a little bit differently than you've done in the past. I've attended several of the city council meetings and sort of witnessed their frustration, their commitment to housing over in North Bayshore, but then their frustration with this seems to be scale backs with all the compromises that need to be made over there. I also have seen Google be very frustrated with having to scale back on what their original plans are, and the real concern about the viability of it if they don't have enough housing to support the infrastructure and the shops and the facilities the common facilities they want there. One of the solutions that or proposals that they made that they addressed to you was to put a standalone school quite a far away from the construction. And I think there is a solution here, and I think that this board and this district can take a real leadership role in solving the problem. And what I'd encourage you to do is think about integrating the school, rather than a standalone school, integrating it into the construction. Put it on the first 3 floors of a 10, 12, 15-story building. And that way you work with Google, you have the school right there, you use the space as efficiently as you possibly can, and help solve Google's problems, help solve the city's problem. At the end of the day, you guys will be real heroes to come out with something novel, exciting, really, really, really different. It's not the current schools, but it's to me, it's exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. Randy?
Exciting to hear all these comments. So let's look at some of our site visits, and we'll see if any board members, and also Dr. Rudolph, you were on some of these visits, have any comments. And if not, I'll fill in, or our team. And by the way, I should introduce Jean Young, who is leading the planning effort with Bill Gould, and Brian Cho with me from Minneapolis, and also on Bill Gould's team, Dietary. So any comments about our visit to Landell's Elementary School?
I don't know what you're asking.
Well, there was a couple of references to seeing the schools that we had visited, and we actually saw 10, and maybe you were referring more to the...
Not our district schools,
Okay.
but the outside sites
All
that we
right,
visited.
all right. Well,
You could keep those in mind though when
Yeah.
comparing. I think we're all probably familiar with all of the current
Okay.
district schools. So
okay. There were some good takeaways to build on that, looking at your schools, the things that were liked at some of the schools we visited, I think were those connections, for example, to the outside. So we saw this model quite a lot where the potential to view or connect outside had a wall with backpacks. And so, and I bring that up because changing that doesn't necessarily mean spending a lot more money or having more space. It's more a value. Do you consider a connection to the outside a distraction, or do you consider it an asset? And that's something for discussion, for the board to discuss. And again, a reference, there was a lot of discussion about heat and shade. And so as a basis, as we look at the other schools that we saw, we saw quite a lot of this heat sinks where it was actually 10 degrees hotter here than in an area with trees. And so these are really important considerations. Whether you have a 10-acre or 2.5-acre site, what is the approach to landscape and green? There is an issue too that comes up with density everywhere, is that sometimes when you have a busy environment, it feels too dense. And so it's not necessarily just having a classroom that's 25% bigger, it's how you curate that space. So if you have some walls where your eye can rest. And so to your point, Ms. Blakely, about wanting to display student work, so important. But if you think about how you display works in, say, a gallery, it's focused, it's curated. So what we want to do is create student display spaces where we... am I going on too long? No, okay.
No, your time's up, sir. Your time's up.
All right. So this is an issue we saw, and we see this everywhere in new schools and older schools, that partly this is an operational thing that we can help teachers in how to curate their spaces to make the best of student display. We saw the use of teacher workrooms, and again, this has very much, so I'm just calling your attention, these issues have to do with space and the opportunity where you've got a workroom, and it's a good workroom, but if you have less space, you might be able to do something like this where there's workspace and also get collaboration space. Sometimes it has to do with the arrangements and the engineering. You're engineering it, when I say engineer, designing a bit more the way you design a car, very thoughtful about all the elements. And we heard an interesting discussion at Nueva today where the science teacher, the lab teacher, was saying that we really needed to have the science, that was a good architect, and yet there wasn't an opportunity for the science teacher to do what we call curriculum mapping. And you educators think of curriculum mapping perhaps as charting, but there's also curriculum mapping where you really have architectural floor plans and get more detailed so that you can get a lot more of what you see here into spaces. And this is just some of the diagramming we're doing. We're working with individual teachers, and the educators on our team are used to working with space, where we're talking about all those details that are in those teacher workrooms. The idea of how we use these multi-purpose spaces. This space is well used right now for eating. I don't think they do a lot of basketball in here.
Yeah.
And it's a big space, but from what I understand, I don't think it's close to an 80% utilization. We can utilize that space 80. We have schools that they're used 100% of the time. And so that has a lot to do with the values, what Dr. Rudolph was talking about, figuring out what do you want, what's important. And then once we define that problem, how do we solve that? It's not necessarily just more space. And it gets to that question I think you asked me, Dr. Rudolph, earlier, how do we make this work? Well, we look at what we have and what's working and what we could do even more of, which is that space is a good space for eating. How do we make it good for learning? Some of the examples where we see some of these heat sinks again, this is a solvable problem. And some of the spaces where you have good spaces, but as three of your principals talked about, Swati, Heidi, and Rebecca, all using these spaces more partly has to do with that educational intention. And then a little bit of help on the architectural side, we can activate these spaces, and there's tremendous potential in these kind of spaces. And I bring it up because when you look at the new schools we toured, you'll see there, in some cases, there's some better use of it. You look at this slide, it's quite a big space. You've got that, 10+ acre site, but look at how the kids are distributed in it. Most of that space is not being used most of the time. Yeah.
I will say on that space in particular, the reason most of that space is not being used is because there's not staff for yard coverage to spread out to the other areas. So the native garden at Mistral, for example, is not used as a play space during the day because there is not staffing. So recess has purposefully been concentrated in that area. And it's not about not using the space. It's about not having the people capacity to use the space.
Terrific point, that talking about space without talking about the staff and even the schedule, time and space and people are all such an important part of that solution that we want to work through in that next 20 months, not when we're in construction. And actually, interestingly, we heard at some of the schools that even the successful ones we visited today, that there were so many things they would have did differently. They left out some of this discussion we could then do that space-based curriculum mapping during the next 20 months. Stevenson, you see again, there's kind of a large heat sink there, and they're talking about what to do about it. This space is being used very well, actually, and it's tiny. So you already have the solutions. We can see it, we can listen, we can see. I think as we define the problem, I think we will probably see that some of those solutions are right in front of us, just a 10 or 15-minute drive. This space is effective, and it gets at a lot of that green. Again, this space is very well used, and it's a small courtyard. And I know Bill has a lot of pride in this work. It's a lovely courtyard, very, very special. Okay, now we're at the schools that many of you haven't seen, and I know that several of you just looked at these, and so I hope you'll help me talk about them, what you saw and what you liked, what was important. And I'll move the slides around if you want. Tell me to go back and forth. Here we are at Gene Parker Elementary School. Any comments, Ms. Conley or Dr.
Well,
Rudolph?
I mean, I think some of the parameters that probably we all need to be familiar with when it comes to planning the spaces are around which grade levels can be at which floors. When second graders were on higher levels, they had to have like a dedicated stair access. What were some of the other things around the code requirements for going up?
So K has to be on the first floor.
Right.
First grade technically can go on the second floor if somebody walks them down, but you can't leave them unattended at any time. So most of the schools that we saw tried to keep K and 1 on the first floor. You're right about the egress for second grade. We saw at Horace Mann today, they didn't have second grade on the second floor, which allowed them to maximize the space and not essentially create a hallway in between. Elevator access is also important. Horace Mann only has 1, but you have to have enough stairwells. Upstairs, so this school actually has 2 playgrounds. Thank you. If you go back.
Sorry. Okay.
So they have 2, both of their play structures are actually, they have one on this roof over here, and then they have another one. So they actually have 3 play yards where they try to capitalize on everything. But again, then you have to take into account the need to make sure that items don't go flying off the roof, which creates larger structures. I'm trying to think of they also have underground parking, and that creates a different issue because obviously, whether it's the water table or if there is underground parking, then that means you can't put underground parking under the kinders because that actually creates a second floor. So you have to take that into account. But in this case, the underground parking is actually under the MUR. The MUR.
Yeah.
And in each case, everyone uses the lot. Every site that we saw put the library common spaces on first or second floors, because you actually can, so if you put the library on the second floor, you sort of maximize the space a little bit more. But because kids aren't in there all the time, you actually don't have to worry about the code requirement because you're walking kids up there. There have to be considerations about north and south. I guess I'm taking some of the things you're saying.
I'll just expand a little bit.
Yeah.
So Gene Parker Elementary School was rebuilt in 1990. The original school was damaged in the Loma Prieta earthquake. So the school is on less than 1 acre. It's in Chinatown. It's very, very urban, very, very compact. Curbside, loading for buses. One of the nice things about Gene Parker Elementary School is that they had commons functions on every floor. So if you look at the end of this corridor is the play court. And then on the opposite behind us is the library. So, and there were workrooms on every level. So that's, one of the sort of takeaways was creating gathering spaces for the faculty and the students on each level so that as you separate the grades from younger kids to older kids, they kind of have their own level. So that's one thing that we saw at Gene Parker. So
How
another
many
school that we
stories
went
was it?
to was the Tenderloin Community Elementary School.
Oh,
I just was
Sure.
curious how many stories the Parker School is.
The Gene Parker Elementary School was 3 stories above ground.
Okay, and then
And-
the parking underneath. Okay.
And so something that I thought was nice at Gene Parker, if you go back to that slide with the hallway.
Okay.
So when we think about our schools and our classrooms, most of them, the classrooms are at ground level. There's an awning that comes out and the access is straight from the outdoors. When we go to the next school that we'll look at in a moment, everything was kind of internal. But this really it's like if you took our classroom wings and you stacked them on top of each other, it was really nice because when you came out of the classroom, you were outside. It was an open hallway.
The I'm spacing out the
Horseman.
Horseman School
It was
had
Horseman's,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we noticed is that in this temperate climate, access to light is possible. And as we see corridors like this where you have natural light to one side and natural light anchoring the end of the corridor, it gives a very, very different feeling from this next school that we're going to see, the Tenderloin, where you have double loaded spaces. You look down the hallway and you don't see natural light. And so one of the things that we saw in the better schools, and we'll see examples, is they use the height of the spaces to really take advantage of being at the canopy level of trees. So you have this indoor-outdoor connection to nature, even though you're removed from the ground. And so we'll flip through some more slides. So Tenderloin was probably the most challenging site. It was, Tenderloin District is a very hard, very urban, a very intense neighborhood. So security and safety is paramount. So this building had a basement, 3 stories above, and then the rooftop play area. Very little landscaping around the building. So the buildings, especially the south-facing spaces, were extremely hot. And then in some areas, so this is like the basement areas, and they didn't do a really good job of bringing natural daylight into some of these spaces that Devin was talking about. Hallways, common areas. So there were at times it was very hard to orient yourself to south, north, daylight. And I think for young children, especially elementary school, in North Bayshore, you really want to give people that connection to the outdoors no matter where they are. And I think we'll see in some examples where that's possible. What was interesting about this space here is that this is the cafeteria, but it was on the upper floor, and there was no adjacent play space to this dining hall. And so after the kids finished eating, they had to stay in the space. So the energy level, the restlessness. So what they said is, had there been an outdoor play space that the kids could run out onto and let the other kids eat, that would have been really ideal. So these are some actually nice areas of the Tenderloin. What makes them nice is the landscaping and the vegetation, the softening of the environment. So on the right is sort of a natural garden that's both a community resource as well as a teacher resource for the students on an informal basis, but also as a teaching tool for the teachers. And so in the urban schools, they take advantage of every available space: roof, decks, lanais, a ground floor. And I think when you're constrained, you'll see in some of these different examples, really maximizing and optimizing opportunities for the kids to get outside.
Is it all right if I interject?
Sure.
So one of the things that was really wonderful about that space, you can see along the left, when you do rooftop playgrounds and you have to have fencing along the side, how do you make it more welcoming and not look like we're, in a juvenile detention center instead? So they had plantings all along the edge. And on their rooftop garden, they had just really large planter boxes that were plots that classes could use if they wanted, but they also had seating. They had tables. It was like a space where people came out and workshopped and could do things.
Glass too. It's not
Yeah.
ceiling fencing.
Yeah.
Or plexiglass, I don't know.
That's not, could we use plexi? I mean, that's
I don't
chain
know
link,
what that
that's chain link fencing.
Is it? It looks
Yeah.
like glass.
But it's painted green and there's plantings in front of it. I think one of the things there, they had put in like concrete steps up to the plantings. If we were doing this on a rooftop and we wanted to think about flexible spaces, we might want to use something like wooden planters or something that we can always move if we change our mind later or want to use the space differently.
Yeah, I think we had asked the principal. We were standing on this. I think this sort of bias in terms of rooftop play areas is sort of the picture on the right. Stark, hot, no shade, and she was. San Francisco just established a green roof ordinance, and if you look at a lot of those green roofs that are taking place now, there's a tremendous amount of variety of softscape, hardscape, shade elements, furnishings. And so this rooftop on the right, as compared to the space on the left, was just blacktop, walls, and chain link. And it was a brutal environment. But there's not that much of a difference between the left and the right in terms of just a little bit of design, shade, turf, less soft elements can really change the sense of a space.
And
So
the one on the left was the pre-K playground. And so that's why they've been approached so differently, and it's on the first floor.
and unfortunately, the space is captive to the pre-K program, so the other kids can't take advantage of it. So this is the urban school. So this was a private school on a very, very small site, approximately 15,000 square feet. You'll see that from the inside, they're taking advantage of high volume spaces, really a sense of bringing natural light into these high volumes. This is a sort of, we went from Tenderloin to here. And so one of the questions that Devin had asked was, can we put turf up here? And so Tot Turf is a surface that the San Francisco Parks and Recs is starting to deploy widely in their playgrounds and dog parks. So I think, to the touch, it was very, very comfortable. They had a green roof element on the right, as well as some benches. And then you can see the protective enclosure for balls, in this case, actually goes around the entire space.
And that turf is synthetic?
Yeah. So this was Horace Mann Elementary School, which is fairly comparable in proportion and scale to the space that Google is offering up for consideration. But 2.9 acres, it has road frontage on 3 sides. And so what you see here is a long canopy that runs along the length of the play area, which is nice as a shade element so that there's relief at any point along the playfield. And you can kind of see how, they've just adding vegetation, vertical landscape elements really starts to soften up the environment. And so the width of this property is about 15-20% wider than the one that we're being considering in terms of a feasibility analysis. But you can see again the upper level hallways, unlike Tenderloin where you had double loaded corridors, very little natural light, a lot of natural light north facing, so very, very much more comfortable. So this was the Nueva School where we went to today. You can see, a little more formal instruction areas on the right, some informal areas on the left, natural light coming in. This was an upper level story with a roof deck on just outside the window on the left that had softscape. And so it was a garden. Interestingly, even though Nueva is a high school, in the summertime, they run K-12 there. So they adapted for the younger children in the summertime. So you can see some of the rooftop spaces. So we are probably at elevation, the 3rd floor, on the left picture. And then what was nice about it, and is on the right side, is that even though it's a high school, so the element of control is different than for an elementary school. The spaces just sort of bled. It was very seamless in terms of the teacher collaboration, the student interaction, very much a collaborative type of environment versus a cells and bells and command and control environment. So again, natural daylight in all areas of the building. We don't have a good picture of in the urban school. If you go back to, let me go back to this image here. That is looking out into the greenway, along Fell Street, in the lower Hay.
Yeah.
So all of those classroom spaces, you look out and all you see is green, and that's something that is potentially viable. When you get to the 2nd, 3rd floor, you're in the canopy level of the trees.
Since you've gone back to that slide,
Okay.
I keep reading that number and thinking I must be reading it wrong. And then I read it again and I think I see the same thing. Does that say 0.15?
Yes. It's basically, it's a building. It's San Francisco. So You know, it's basically a large building. I think, Ayunda, you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah. So in this building, they actually have a gym, cafeteria, 7 classrooms. They have
Offices.
There's offices,
Fitness.
teachers lounge, business offices.
Right.
And the
as well.
rooftop space.
Right. The one thing I will say is that even though this is on 0.15 acres, so it gives you an idea of what's possible. They also do have a separate building, which is actually 4 buildings that have been sort of pushed together. So it was like an old firehouse, the building next door, and then 2 other buildings that they also use as their campus. But they have been very intelligent about how they have sort of maximized every single thing in order to make this work. But this is the newest structure that they had.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really different is, let's say, compared to Horace Mann, is in the schools that the better examples that we saw, you know, there was basically a whole village on every level, where there was informal activities, you know, instructional spaces, collaborative spaces, you know, whether it be play courts, libraries. And so, unlike the Horace Mann model, where the majority of those functions are at the ground level, so, you know, the people at the upper level have to travel down to these spaces and then travel back up. You know, we would envision wanting to create sort of a vertical, you know, vertical-oriented village. You know, if we go to like 2-3 stories, you know, having spaces at the second level, having spaces at the third level, so that it's not that everything's on the ground floor and the people at the upper level lose out and have to constantly go up and down.
If you go back just real quick, they also, so for instance, we had talked about earlier with Trustee Conley, the need to have the green space and sort of these flexible wooden planters over here. So they have, like, you know, even though they haven't been taking care of it, there's clearly this planting area. You have places to sit. Even though the net, it's only a net, the shade was a little bit better up there. That's a green turf that people could play basketball on, or not basketball, soccer. And then it was tiered sort of levels or structures. So like when you went to the other building, there was one just a little bit above the next one. And so at every single level, there seemed to be some type of space that kids can go outside and sort of enjoy. And so I think incorporating that, something in that facet, sort of capitalizes on the space. Also thought that if you go back one more, the use of the gym. So if you're thinking of a middle school, right? How do you make sure that you can add? That gym actually holds 600 students or 600 people. And so here you have a full-size gym that can house a lot of the central activities, and they came up with sort of solutions to sort of make this work. So it just gives you the possibility of what could you do if you had to design around a particular space. There was one school, actually Nueva School today, where they talked about the gym was on the second floor. And so that created a totally different environment. And instead of having this open space where kids, you know, everything sort of funnels into this one central hub, the gym at Nueva really felt like an afterthought.
Yeah, so the gym was on this level. One thing interesting about like Horace Mann is, so the kindergarten, first grade, and second grade were all on the ground floor. So the third and fourth grade was on the second floor, and fourth and fifth were on the third floor. The library is on the second floor. So for half of the students, the library is on the same floor as their classroom. And then for the other half, it's only a level removed. So for example, if the library had been on the ground floor, all of those students would be constantly going up and down the stairs. And then the building there on the little wing on the left was a large faculty workroom. So again, for half of the third, fourth, and fifth grade faculty, they were on the same level as their workroom, and that workroom was then directly connected to the administration, which is on the ground floor. So again, it's a bit of a three-dimensional puzzle in terms of really wanting, but it's executable. Let me flip forward to a graphic scale diagram. So this is what you see on the left is Horace Mann Elementary School, 2.9 acres. You can see the play field, about 31,000 square feet. You can see the aerial perspectives on the top. And then on the right is the 2.5 acre school site in the darker shade. And then the 1 acre park site to the left. So it's a little narrower than the Horace Mann site and longer. And I'll go back one slide, and this is the California Department of Education, the outdoor play space requirements for a kindergarten school of about 685, 700 students. So you can see 4 10,000 square foot play fields on the left, which is roughly just under an acre. Hard courts, apparatus areas. And so one of the challenges that we'll have as we move forward is, we're trying to answer the question, can this site work? And is there a loss programmatically in terms of the quality of education? And so as we test that question, this diagram here is the CDE's programmatic requirements in terms of number of classrooms for kindergarten, first, second, third, TK, and then the multipurpose, administration, learning commons, and then parking. And so the challenge for us in supporting the district through its decision making is, can this fit and how might it fit in a way that supports the educational objectives of this district?
What are learning commons?
What was that?
Learning commons.
Learning commons is like the library media center.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So you can see a little bit the importance of the park site, and we've met with the city, and they are going into this with the assumption that the park site is a shared use space, that the school would potentially have captive use of that space during school days. That's just based on just informal discussions at this point. It will need further resolution in terms of formalizing that. But this is the parcel of land that Drugo is proposing to create from the land that they have right now.
I'm going to have to interrupt you. It is 7:55. I'm going to need a motion to extend the meeting.
I don't think we need a motion to extend the meeting unless it was 10 o'clock.
Oh, we don't?
No.
Okay. Never mind then. Strike that. from the
Okay,
record.
so I'd like to open it. Devin, Ellen, and Laura, you guys have been on the visits with us. What are some of your observations, some questions that remain in your mind, some unresolved issues in terms of, gee, I wonder how we're going to do this, or I wonder how we're going to do that, or some things where, I really like this, or really like that. What were some of your thoughts as you shared them with Jose and Tamara?
Well, just looking at this schematic, I don't know what you call it. I hadn't appreciated that the park site was off to the left. The principals were talking about sight lines and being able to, monitor what was going on in the ground level play open areas. And this doesn't lend itself so well to that to me. I mean, I think if you could do more of a U but because it's long, that will be a little bit more of a challenge for the ground level open space area.
Yeah, I think that the challenge is both going to be visual and circulation. And then where do you put the parking? Because you don't want the parking to separate things, but definitely, line of sight. What Laura's referring to is because of Horace Mann's location in downtown San Jose, they do have homeless people immediately outside their fence line. And so for them, because they have multiple points of entry, it's important for them to be able to maintain line of sight to those points of access. I think for Gene Parker, Tenderloin, and Horace Mann, there was very much a very hard perimeter, fences, walls, gates. in some cases, multiple layers. And so one of the challenges is, like in Nueva's was more open. It did not have like a perimeter fence or perimeter wall, but Allende noticed that there were roving guards. And one of the problems that they had is they had kind of two entrances, and so they had two reception areas. I think as we think about this, even though we can take advantage of the multiple access points in terms of like at Horace Mann, they had preschool coming in, and at one point they had TK and K coming in at another point, and then they had the rest of the school coming in at that point. How do you maintain line of sight and supervision over those areas during the hours when those are open?
Right. The elementary schools all commented on talking about elopers and making sure that they were kept safe. The two independent schools, more with Nueva than urban school, talked a lot about, this is an urban school, more houses are coming here, more people are walking through, and that's become a big concern of theirs. And while they didn't establish a hard perimeter, they were very concerned about people coming in and making sure. So they have, they spend a lot of time working on the processes to make sure that people who are supposed to be there, that they're wearing name badges, even if you do know them, and that they have 3 security guards that are constantly roving the building, as well as the grounds people always have radios on also. So it's I guess the big thing is, out of all 5 schools, safety and security was a big thing. Urban school made sure that we walked with someone the whole time, but you had to have some type of badge or ID the whole time as you will.
You don't have the sort of the horizontal buffer that you'll have, on a 10, 13 acre site where you might have, parking, landscaping, 60-foot offset between the sidewalk and, your front gate. I think one of the challenges of urban is that distance, that buffer gets compressed. And so, how do you manage that? So I think, we're all still in a very learning discovery phase in terms of what are the things that we need to solve for to make this work, if we're going to make this work. And so we're still very early in that process.
Well, and
Devin.
they may put a hotel right across the street, so I'm still not as wild about this site, for
Sure.
that reason.
That's where I'm very confused. I know this isn't even a completely done deal in terms of the site and what we may or may not be asking for in the future. So I'm struggling with, we had another site as an idea as well. And so I'm thinking, for each site, I would actually request different types of things, and there would be different things possible.
Right.
So it becomes, at least in my mind, a little challenging to say what I would prefer, because it would be different depending on the actual site.
Yeah.
I think if you envision this as the worst case scenario, if you
Right.
envision that this is the only thing that comes to the board, that this is the best offer that Google's going to have, and that there is no alternative, then how do you make this site work? If we get something different, then if we get something that's larger, it definitely changes how you configure everything and what your approach is. But if this 2.5 acre site is it, right, and we have 700 kids that could possibly end up there, how do you make a 2.5 acre site work? And I think that's sort of the way that we've been approaching
Well, I think,
this.
there's a series of questions, because we're testing the feasibility of this offer.
Right.
Are we even going to entertain it? Are we even going to accept it?
And-
The first question that has to be,
Right.
right.
Well, and I think that's one of the things the board could easily say, after looking at the examples, that this tight of an urban model just does not meet the education, that doesn't fit or doesn't offer a comparable educational experience. And so this is just a non-starter. We need X amount of acres. I mean, that is a possibility. But if the idea is that we are going to create a school on this site, because this is the worst case scenario, then, what do you want this to be a K-5? Do you, considering all the constraints that are on there? And then we start sort of building for this worst case scenario. I would say it cannot house a middle school and a K-5, right? It can't be a K through 8. So you would have to choose, maybe this is just a middle school because it's a small compacted campus. You've seen a 0.15 example. Maybe that's doable. But I think the board needs to weigh in terms of telling us whether or not they think this is even feasible and provides a comparable experience.
I think
I
it
have
would
a
be
quick-
really
oh,
helpful to see on these diagrams what the sun angle is. We have apparently 12-story buildings on either side of us, so we could say we want light and that it doesn't
So,
mean anything.
I,
If we're,
I will say in response to that, I was very concerned about light for the school site and then going to the Tenderloin site, which has like 15-story buildings beside it.
right next to it.
It was so hot and they had
Okay.
so much sun during the middle of the day when kids were in school. I was really surprised.
Okay.
So I am less concerned now with the light issue than I was previously.
Okay.
And more concerned about how do we provide shade if we have a rooftop playground, which I did not expect. Like that was a big change from actually going to the spaces that
Yeah.
I thought it would be very different.
That's good to know because not having gone, I wouldn't have had that experience. So.
Yeah, I think that the question that was asked to us, and we're still sort of this corporate, journey is Google's offering us 2.5 and another acre for another park, that related. First question: are there examples out there that we can look at to even know if this is even executable? How does this compare with the programmatic requirements that the state's going to require of the district? And then, is there proof of concept that this is even feasible? Can we even entertain the question? So I think that by virtue of the site visits and by virtue of looking at this program diagram and looking at, particularly Horace Mann was particularly helpful because a lot of these other examples are kind of apples to oranges. Gene Parker, Tenderloin's like, okay, that you can do it, but that's certainly something we don't want to do in North Bayshore. Horace Mann is like, wow, this is really close to the parameters we're being given. It's very close to the number of students that we need to address, and they had to fulfill DSA, CDE requirements. So I think the takeaway from this is that there is proof of concept, it is executable, but it is a model that is not typical of the Mountain View Western School District. One of the challenges that we articulate to the Nueva School folks, that's private, is even though they're a private school, they're in a competitive marketplace where they have parents asking them, why should I send my kid and pay $40,000 to school with only 2.7 acres when I can send my child to a school with 30 acres? So, we said from a public school district's point of view, it's a question of fairness and equity. Can we provide education to a student on 2.5 and 3.5 acres and not diminish the quality of their education when compared to a child who goes to a 10-acre site? The thing that CDE will challenge the district and the Nueva head of school challenge the district is programmatically, think beyond just the simple numbers. Programmatically, what do you want to do in those outdoor spaces? What kind of games, what kind of activities, and then can you, on a sort of open-ended basis, can you fulfill your physical education, your outdoor recreation requirements, your play requirements, within that? CDE will ask the district that question, and so the other example that's currently underway is in Mission Bay. They are planning for an elementary school on about 2.5 acres, but it's adjacent to a large park. So San Francisco Unified is going through the same process right now in terms of establishing the feasibility of a very small elementary school site. So I think, relative to Allende's charge to us, no, it's not a done deal, but before he can, advise and provide a recommendation to the board, he needed to first, is there proof of concept? Are there examples? And so that's what the last couple of days have been about.
How big is that park area? Like how many? I'm just thinking about like 5th grade, presidential fitness exams.
1 acre.
Can they do a 50-yard dash, 100-yard dash? Like I don't know how that 1 acre competes.
So 1 acre is 220 feet by 220. So it's about 70 yards.
Okay, so it's two, so this is about, and this was fairly square, so it's
Yeah,
probably
it's fairly square.
220.
So it's about 230 by 200 or so.
Thank you.
I have a question. Dr. Rudolph, I understand that we had earlier in the year mentioned to you and Google had noticed what the demands or requests from the board were in terms of the proposals that were given to us and what we would like to see, because it was asked, what would the board like to see? And I understand that you had said that you were planning on having Google come and address the board. Do we have a specific date as to when they're going to come and address the board?
They haven't confirmed. They said that they were consulting the city manager to see whether or not he thought that it was feasible for them to come.
So what does that mean?
It means that they are waiting for Dan Rich to give them blessing to show up to our meeting.
Okay, so in the meantime, I guess that explains why we're doing this at the same time, because there may be an issue that there won't, even though it was asked of us what we would like to see, they may not be able to meet those requests. Okay.
I think, and I said this today when we were traveling, I think Google has looked at this and said very intentionally, because they actually were the ones who provided us with Horace Mann, that here is an example of a school right down the street from you on a similar size plot. We have fulfilled our requirement, and it makes it a little bit difficult for us to argue that we are expecting something different when 2.8 acres exist and there's a school there. And I think that's why this is in front of you right now.
Okay, I get that. So thank you for taking the time to explain that to the board and to the community. And then since we have time to be able to discuss a little bit about these issues, I'd like to just reiterate that if that's looking to be the case, I would expect Javier to give us an update fairly quickly then, because if not, why bother to ask the board what we would like to see? I would appreciate that very much, senor. Having said that, the Horace Mann option looks to me like, out of all these, the best site for something like this. And I would expect that we would be able to do our best to accommodate whatever needs we have to do for incorporating nature and landscaping, a play structure, or a gym. It looks more like, for me, this may be the best option you can get for an elementary school site, perhaps. But there's a lot of maneuverability. I look at the math and technology centers that we have here and over at Crittenden, and I see the potential for the usage of space that we use inside those buildings to also be that same concept where things are flexible, we can move things around. There's some areas for community building and for community exercise. There's some other areas for independent thinkers and independent projects. It goes on and on and on. So having said that, if it's a middle school site, I don't know that this may be our site. Ideally, I would like to see two sites there, because I think we need two sites, one elementary and one middle school, which then leads me to agree with City Councilwoman Margaret Abicoga in terms of having the space that she had proposed on the other side of Shoreline, where it's all, what was it, 10, like what, 10 acres worth?
I think it was five, and it was near
between
that.
5 to 10, where you have the ability to incorporate more of what we have in terms of natural landscape design into the architectural scheme of the school sites.
Well, I would say that would be my preference as well. However, just surely to the point of, is this feasible? Because of Horace Mann, I'd say yes, although I really struggle with the configuration. If you look at that one, at least it's built around the open space part that does have the sight lines. And with this long skinny thing in the park at one end, I just think it's harder. I mean, can it be done?
Yeah,
I think probably it can. I just
Yeah, I
think
that
it's not optimal.
I think the next challenge for us will be to start laying it out and seeing, okay, what doesn't this in fact look like, in different ways. One of the obvious missed opportunities at Horace Mann is they could have easily put a deck over the parking and put a play field on that would have been accessible from the second or third floor, so that one, it would have created a second play field, and that playfield would have been directly accessible for the upper level kids. Kind of like at Gene Parker, they had a play court at the end of a corridor, and you looked at the flow. The corridor was wide, about 12 feet, and it just flowed really nicely. And I think that's part of that idea of having things at upper elevations that anchor the activity at those elevations. I know Randall had prepared some case study slides of other examples, but in more, he brings a perspective that's more global, given that's his area of work. Would you guys be interested in seeing some of the other more global examples of sort of urban school models?
Do you think they'd be useful in terms of evaluating it against this particular site?
I think what they would do is they would establish, more proof of concept, that it is a concept that is not uncommon, within a different, geographic, setting.
I think before we get to that, at least for me, I'd like to look at this diagram you have
Okay.
here of all the outdoor spaces, because I think we're all, one of the reasons we're interested in the possibility of an alternative site is to maximize the use of outdoor spaces. And that's where I think we're all kind of struggling with this current layout, the orientation of it, its length, it's a little different. You have this diagram here, though. I believe it's that one.
Yeah.
So there's 4 fields. There are 8 hard court areas. I believe our apparatus area, I'm going to assume, is a play structure. Is
Yeah.
that correct? Okay.
So this is the CDE's generic boilerplate requirement
For a certain number of
for
schools, kids.
an elementary school of 685 students.
Okay. So this is what I'm struggling with
Sure.
for that site. And before we get into all the creative solutions, can you see making that work at this site?
Sorry.
That's a kind of a critical piece of
I
information
think
for
that
me.
with the park, I think you can make a majority of it. I don't know if you can make all of it. I think from the point of view of, sorry, there's a little bit of a lag here. I think from the point of
John, I think
view
we're
of,
frozen.
let's take, for example, Horace Mann. Horace Mann only had 3 play courts, 1 play field. But there were some lost opportunities, like the decking of
Yeah.
over the parking, et cetera, et cetera. So they could have made better use of those spaces. So I think that it's possible if we go up.
So like a hard court play or field area on every level? Is that what you're?
No, so
That's an
probably,
impossibility?
so I think in this case, we can meet the playfield requirement just from probably a combination of the park and then a playfield within the site.
Okay.
So let's say, 3 of those 10,000 square foot fields in the park, 1 or 2 of those in the site. And then in terms of the play court, we may not have 8, but we probably could do 4 to 5, comfortably. In terms of the apparatus areas, the main thing is having one for, TKK, 1, 2, and then maybe the older grades. So like at Horace Mann, they only had 2 apparatus areas. So one of the challenges that the CDE will ask for the district is, okay, if you're going to be short of our standard requirements, how are you going to address the program requirements, for outdoor play? So I don't know that we're going to fulfill all of that requirements. That is typical of like a 10 to 13 acre site. I think we'll be short of that.
Mhm.
The question then becomes to the school or the district, can you fulfill your programmatic requirements on something less than that, generic template?
Well, and
I'm sure we can, but do we want to? I mean, outdoor play for 5 to 10-year-olds is critical for their development.
yeah, I mean, I think this speaks to the idea of play spaces at multiple levels, and that some of those play spaces, they might be hardscape, but they might be hardscape with turf and actually a play structure on them. A lot of the models that we visited were sort of around a courtyard of some sort. And so you have that lower kinder level. Maybe this is like an L-shaped building that we put on the site that runs east to west. And then the short part of the L comes toward the south on the end. And so you have kind of a protected, or, on either side, whatever way you do the L, you have a long, skinny kind of courtyard that might have the play structure space and hardscape for your K1, 2. And then either on the rooftop or on maybe one end goes up 3 stories and one end goes up 2, and you have your hardscaping up there. But we do try to configure it for some sort of play structure or climbing structure. If it was like a 2-story or 3-story, if you had this hardscape area on one floor and then you had another floor going up beside it higher, we could do something creative like a climbing wall along the side of the wall for the structure that continued to go up, so that maybe then the overall play structure wouldn't be as large.
I think the example that Devin, I'm guessing is what we saw at Gene Parker Elementary School, where you had, the K1 play court and apparatus area on the ground floor. We had sort of like a second, third grade play court area on the second floor, and then we had like an upper elementary, play area that was even larger on the roof. So the thing about this site is thinking about it 3-dimensionally, and not just from a land basis. I think at 10 and 13 acres, you can kind of just, lay it all out, throw it around and it'll fit. I think with a site like this, we've got to stack the classrooms, 2-3 stories. We've got to, take advantage of rooftops, and not have sort of single use, single function footprint, over land. And so I think that's probably the next step in sort of testing the site, is coming back to you with some options, saying, okay, this is what it potentially could look like. And then having you, again, still with, eyes open, are we willing to consider this or not?
And so the things that matter for me, if we're looking at this scenario, are not just when we went into the buildings in San Francisco, when we went into Tenderloin and the urban school, it was very much you had like a hard shell structure, and then all of the hallways were inside. And I'm not really interested in that for K-5 and having it be equitable to what we have elsewhere in the district. I like the 12-foot walkway. The walkway on one level provided structure, shade for the play structure down below.
So more the Gene Parker model.
More like Gene Parker, although Gene Parker's still kind of not an ideal site because it's a very small site, and you have you lose a lot of space to individual stairways that were going up to classrooms at different levels for egress. And so I think we would want to be more efficient with that. But when we looked at, I think it's the Nueva School, where you have like the classroom space that opens and you can come out and there's a more informal space, rather than having that informal space be glassed off, maybe you have the classroom space and you have like a deep deck.
Right.
I saw one
your
of those at
informal-
Horseman, and I really
Okay.
liked that too.
Right.
Yeah, so your informal space is more of an indoor-outdoor space, rather than just glass.
Yeah, I think the thing that we realized when we went to Horseman or went to Nueva is that when you put a function on the same level as the activity, it doesn't feel like you're in a multi-story building, because you're flowing as if you were on the ground floor, including a garden or including a turf lawn. So I think that there are ways to. I think it's solvable. What it looks like is a different question. The thing that I was surprised, going up yesterday, I was expecting Gene Parker, which was the tightest, most vertical site. I was expecting that site to be the most oppressive. But I was really surprised, and I think, Devin, you were too, that it actually felt quite spacious.
It felt much more open than the other
It
sites.
felt much more open.
Yeah.
And it was Tenderloin because of the double-loaded corridors, because of the lack of landscaping, because of the dark hallways, and the hallways that didn't terminate in a view that felt very, very oppressive. And so I think that there are ways to get around it. But still, I think CDE is going to push back. How are you going? You are going to be on a third of the recommended acres that we, give guidance for. So how are you going to fulfill all your outdoor learning, your outdoor recreation, your physical education? And I think that the challenge for us as a design consultant is how many play fields can we provide? How many play courts can we provide? How many apparatus areas can we provide? And still have a site that flows well and is organized well. One of the lessons that we learned, I think Allende picked up on this, is that there's a loss of efficiency in terms of space when we start to put first and second grade classrooms on the upper level, because you have to dedicate these vertical circulation cores what was surprising is like at Gene Parker and Tenderloin, the stairwell goes straight into the classroom. And that's how they, because the requirement for the CDE is that it can only be used by those children. It can't be commingled with the older kids. So they didn't open it to a common corridor. And so, but that dedicates a whole, vertical core in the building. And so what we saw in Horace Mann is that they really took advantage of that and had the K through 2 and even preschool just flowing out into these play areas and apparatus areas. And then they had the, the upper level grades flowing into the, library, and they had a different separate path to the playground. So I think it's sort of a three-dimensional puzzle. But
And to piggyback off of that, I have a question here that might be more something that we pose to the city, but because they're going to have the park site, could we build our parking underneath the park site? Like not as a basement, but could we put in parking and then the public park site is on top of our parking structure?
I mean, outside of the water tables that are.
Yeah,
that
so
exist
that's
there.
why we couldn't go down. It would have to
Right.
be like ground level parking, and then you have like a lofted park.
Yeah. I
Um,
don't know why that would be
I
an
think,
issue.
it doesn't hurt to ask the question.
Right.
And then you can design, so, like kind of in Seattle, how you have a lot of, stair-stepping kind of parks
Mhm.
that
Like
blend-
terraced
yeah,
up,
terrace
and
parks,
then-
so it
Yep.
just, it comes down to the street edge, but you can have, parking areas.
I'm
Yeah.
also
Trying to
wondering,
put the K up, you have to do parking underneath one side and the K.
Well, it's like
Right.
it's like a little pyramid or a little a pyramid stair steps up to a plateau.
So how
I'm
about,
really wondering about fifth grade education, fifth grade physical education. Those kids need to run. There's a
Long
bunch of things they need to
distances.
do. Is that park space big enough
Right.
to
Mhm.
satisfy the requirements? I'm not sure what they are,
Yeah.
but I know that they have a lot of running.
Well,
So I would just say the Horace Mann site doesn't have an adjacent park space, and you still meet the physical ed requirements. And so that field was pretty expansive. I think it's capable, it's
Kathy, can you
possible
go forward a slide.
if you build along the edges and the outside, and then you sort of create it within that area. Whether or not it's ideal is a completely different question.
So if you look at this play field, it's about 31,000 square feet. So 1 acre is about 43,560 square feet. So this park is about, 25, 30% bigger than the play field at Horace Mann. So one play field prescribed by the CDE is about 10,800 square feet. So for a school this size, they suggest 4, and again, it's a recommendation.
Okay.
So 4 is about 1 acre, 43,000 square feet. So this on its own would fulfill the CD requirement. But I think, going back to some of your comments, you'd want some play field here so that not everybody from this side of the campus has to travel all the way over here. And so this is, part of the puzzle that we'll need to figure out is getting all the adjacencies so that, people are not walking past each other, having things that are close by so that, a teacher in their classroom can just watch a child leave their classroom, go to an apparatus area, go to a play field and come back without, like at Landals where you need 4 teachers to watch 4 kids because there's no line of sight between these areas.
Well, and that's
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's also important that, and this is the reason why we brought this up a couple of times, the park site really should be dedicated to the school, because if you think about Bub, the park is not used by the school. It is a completely separate park that is controlled by the city. And we saw this, you see it at Bub, and you also see it at Nueva, where they have to ask or request permission in order to use the park. So if the idea is that if it's, to a joint use, that the city has access to it after hours, it actually behooves us to have the park as a part of the land. So then that way we can control who has access in and out, which would allow you to meet the requirements that Gene and you were talking about in terms of running up and down and not have to worry about who's walking the dog or whether or not this is parents or all the security issues that come with it.
So I have a question. So in terms of like the CDE, do they have like a minimum standard for acreage and what is required of that from the school districts to have in order to build a school? Or is it just open.
It's a recommendation.
And,
So,
and the recommendation is
yeah.
what now?
So Kathy, if you can go back one slide. So this reflects CDE's guidance. It's a recommendation. It's not a requirement. What it is that if you go less than this, then you have to provide justification. In other words, CDE's concern is that if you provide less than this, then demonstrate to us how you're not going to shortchange the programmatic, requirements of your school. So in Horace Mann's example, we asked them about, how do your different grades use these play areas? So they manage it from a schedule operational point of view. So they have staggered, recess periods for different grades, that kind of thing. If you, Kathy, you go back one more slide. And then this is CDE's recommended number of classrooms for this level of enrollment. So the challenge for us is to fit that onto this site together with all the other play areas.
Right, and I think that's my concern, that
Sure.
if the CDE has certain prerequisites for us to fulfill, the last thing I want to do would be the poster child for doing something less.
Right.
Because that's just a justification then to think of our schools as a less than as opposed to an equal to.
Sure.
And the less space you use, the less valuable I think they may look at the school system in general. I would rather not go into that situation if I had a choice,
Right.
because I would prefer a value to our space, because there's a necessity to the acres that we're asking for, because it does affect the quality of education for every child, regardless of age or economic and social status background. And
Yeah.
I'm hoping that people understand that from that perspective, because again, I don't want to do more with less, because I think we're just proving a point that I don't want to prove.
Sure.
So I'd like to jump in here a little bit. We were talking after the tours today about how we could educate our community about this school, and it gets back to the very beginning of our slides where we're showing what creative things can be done, what creative educational models can be done. So instead of thinking of this as a less than, it would be an exciting option. So
That's one way to look at it.
it is.
But it's not the way I'm looking at it.
Well, so try to think
So,
about it. So one of the things we were talking about literally is, should this be a school that we allow kids from outside of the area to go to? And I was arguing no, because we want the traffic. But I'm opening my mind to if it's an exciting educational model, with utilizing, these open spaces, and it's totally different than the kind of school that I grew up with.
Right.
So opening my mind to this, thinking that this is a more kind of idea that I think parents and would be excited about their children going to.
I get that. It's not a matter for me of opening my mind. It's just a matter of preference. And that's a big distinction. So I can see where you're going with this. And we would have to sell it as something exciting, because that would be our role as a board. Since that would be, in essence, if this is the best offer we get, this is the best we can do. And we'll maximize that space, and we'll be creative with it, with its usage and its educational approach. But I'm choosing literally not to go that route, because I don't like it.
So, and I'll tell you.
And we can discuss more
yeah,
of this afterwards if you like.
Yeah. I am older than any of you, trying not to be stodgy, trying to keep my mind flexible regarding educational models. And I'll tell you, I saw those schools today and I thought, boy, I wish my son could go to these today.
Sure, and
So-
I like Horace Mann, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But it's like how you had your approach with the auditoriums, we had to have it be equal. Well, that's my approach here as well. If we can have something bigger or about the same size as Horace Mann itself, and not something less than with acreage, I'd prefer that.
I just want to bring this slide up here, and not as an example, but just to sort of reflect Gene's idea and Randy's idea about stacking, right? So here, if you envision you have a play field on the top, that large space would be MUR. Then below it is yet another play area. On the sides are your classrooms that are sort of stacked. Then you have the lower level, which could have been your younger kids, and then you have a park out there. It's just I use this as just an example to show if you think sort of three-dimensionally about this puzzle and start stacking things a little bit differently, you can come up with something that sort of meets the requirements. Whether or not it's ideal, I think is a decision that the board has to make, but at least demonstrates that there are examples throughout the world where if you stack and you play a little bit more, you can be a little bit more flexible, and are the hardest requirements of K through 2. After you get past K through 2, even if it's middle school or anything else, you can go vertically up, and your requirements are a lot less, because then it's just about elevators, stairs, right, and everything else. And I think so. I just want to point that out, that there are a lot of possibilities that exist.
The other thing that CD I'm sorry, Devin, but the other thing that CD recognizes is that the nature of play from TK to 5 is very different from the nature of play, middle school, high school, and especially the scale of play for a 4, 5, 6-year-old is very different from the scale of types of games that are done, for 9, and 10-year-olds. And so I think we have play fields for the older grades, they need the bigger fields. For the younger grades, you need more purpose-built, purposely configured spaces that support the nature of the activity. And so that's where I think once we get into it, or once you get to that point, it becomes sort of a design and matching the nature of libraries, the nature of informal gathering spaces, the nature of outdoor play spaces with the age, so that it reflects what they need to do. Brandon, go ahead.
Sure. It seems like a great discussion, really healthy. So Ellen, you're pointing out the excitement of a different model, and Jose, you're talking about, well, the potential limitations of it. That's just what we need to be doing. And also your request about having Google come in and make a presentation. If you think about that slide about a more open network, or in Costa Rica where learning is happening in the whole community, one way to expand it, so rather than be less than, it's more, is to engage some of the other organizations. How might you engage with Google properties where they're actually sharing some of their space in a way? And of course it needs to be supervised in a way, but you could do that with small groups of kids who are out, and even the hotel that you're worried about, Laura. Okay, so part of that requirement is that if a hotel is going to be across from a street, what's exciting about that hotel? You think about kids playing kitchen, how they're playing store. And we think actually at the community college and university level, we actually, and high school level, create hotel hospitality environments so kids can learn how to provide service, what those attitudes are. It could go both ways. So maybe part of keep having this dialogue, this Socratic kind of dialogue, and look at it as not something stressful, but this is the key that could help you create something that's special anywhere. That there's maybe you have a better school and you have more space, but maybe you don't have to have 100% ownership or pay for all the maintenance of it or even all the staffing of it. When you think about organizations like Google, they support their staff to actually go out and volunteer a lot of times. So if they're doing that, what was one of the schools we were at where they said they had 21 Google people who were volunteering time? So perhaps they do that. Yeah.
So one of the things that has come up with us when we've looked at the Google's plans for the neighborhoods that they've put forth, they have sort of like a social corridor connecting two social hearts. And when they planned those, which when I think of, a retail, restaurant, space, parks, like open, flowing pedestrian access areas, that you're kind of I think you might be envisioning a little bit, and like we saw in those earlier slides, the school was just like an afterthought plugged in somewhere else for them. So it's not connected to that social corridor. There would have to be some reconfiguration, I think, in their plans and their master planning to actually make this more accessible and more incorporated and more part of the community. But right now, that is not what has happened.
So I'm sorry, earlier, you were about to make a comment or a question. Sorry, I cut you off there.
Oh, I had a question about this example of the Singapore American school because when I see that cantilevered MUR at the top, I think seismic requirements here, and I imagine that would be incredibly expensive to do here, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is more diagrammatic of an idea.
Yeah.
It's not so much this is what we're proposing, but it's
Okay.
this idea that Allende is saying that, this idea, it's a three-dimensional puzzle. And, thinking about spaces and relationships three-dimensionally.
So do you have enough from us to try and figure out where we'd like to go, or what else are you expecting from the board? If there's something that we haven't provided, please let me know so we can try to delve into that. And then if you could please answer my question, which would be for the second step in terms of conceptual design.
Sure.
After the feedback that you received from us here tonight,
Sure.
how soon will we be able to receive that as well?
We could probably give you something to look at within a month.
And do
And
you
some
need
different
anything?
things, like a couple, not just one thing, but a
Yeah,
few
we'd
different
probably
ideas.
do like 3 or 4 alternatives.
I'd really like to explore this idea of working with the city around that park space. Because if we're saying that that large field space is ideal for older children, and we put that park is on the second floor, and then we can utilize the area underneath for parking or adult offices or whatever, then it could actually connect to the second floor of the school or third floor where older students are, could connect directly to the park.
Yeah, I think right now I would characterize as, the discussions with the city have been extremely informal. So what I would encourage is considering the importance of the park to the school, the viability of the school site,
Mhm.
is maybe formalizing those discussions so that it's a little more reliable in terms of these representations. And I don't know, Allende, we can work with you in terms of facilitating that so that it's not just an informal discussion amongst staff to staff, but it's actually, sort of more a conversation that can be held accountable.
Well, it would be a waste to plan this in
Right.
some way that used that space and then not actually be able to use
Right,
it. So
right.
And I think that's the tension that we face here, because I don't know if we have, even from the superintendent, a final word in terms of when a formalization of anything's going to come about, because of Google's inability to communicate right now, at least, a counter proposal to the ideas that they asked of us to share with them about a month or so ago, maybe a month and a half.
Right.
And now we're at this stage where we're happy to hypothesize, if this is the worst case scenario, what would you like to do?
I think, I'll just be honest. I do not see them moving from this position. I don't know if there's any incentive for them to move from this position. I think, they, and I can't remember, I thought I sent you their responses to your questions that I raised in the meeting. They did a light diagram where they showed that the shade was sun. I'll resend the document again.
Yeah.
But my belief is that they, at least in their minds, they have addressed this problem, and that they view this site as adequate, and without something else happening, they're not going to move from their current position. And so, staff is left with the idea that this may be the best that we get. And so if that's the case, how do we make this work? If that's not the case, if the board wants to pass on this, we need to know. And then I think that's a totally different approach that needs to be taken. But my perspective, just considering that they've answered in writing. They're not here, even though I requested a month ago for them to come. And they were happy to participate in the planning, sort of the visioning of how to make this work. I think this may be the best option there without something else occurring.
So the email that you're going to reroute to us, they answered our questions. And did you also give us, I'm sorry, I don't remember seeing the email, so I have to go back.
No, it's fine.
But did you also give us then in that email, what you're sharing with us now, that this is as good as it gets? There hasn't been an update since then. I've asked them to come over. They haven't shown up yet. I think this is the best deal we're gonna have to work with.
I mean, this is my personal assessment, right? I don't want to.
But that wasn't in the email that you.
No,
Okay.
I don't want to. They simply answered the questions. We had a meeting in April. Maybe a week later, they responded back. Here's our responses. Now, in their defense, we did go to spring break right afterwards, and so that could be also part of it. But just my general feeling, and
I think we participated in those discussions with Google. The big one was getting them off of that site 2 miles away.
Right.
That was a huge deal. They conceded pretty quickly. And I think from their point of view, considering the net available development acreage within the 3 complete neighborhoods of North Bayshore, 10 acres is sort of a non-starter for them. If we want 10 acres, we can't have location. If we want location, we can't have 10 acres.
Right, and I think that's what we have to get finalization on.
Right,
So I would
right.
appreciate if the superintendent could follow up on
Right.
getting more substantial answers from them so that we can
Sure.
we could be closer to this final analysis, and then together as a board, we can problem solve to see what can we do.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that makes sense unless you think it.
That's very fair. Absolutely.
so I think if you want us to design on this particular piece of property, then we can. If your desire is, to not.
Well, it sounds like what you're suggesting is that there's a little bit of conjecture and speculation going on, and sort of third-party representation of Google's position. Let's hear from Google. Is this it, or is there wiggle room?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for understanding that.
Yeah.
What is the timeline we're predicting on this too? Like, what are we kind of shooting for? In terms of when would we think that, I mean, we have to wait for them to develop housing before we put in a school, or would we begin construction of a school in 2 years, or what are we kind of envisioning along that?
I mean, these projects are sort of running on their own, right? So I think if, I need a majority of the board to say your opinion. No offense, Trustee Gutierrez Jr., but I need more than, I need 3 of y'all to all agree that that's what you want. If you want to spend more time on finding out, is this the final answer, then that's fine. And
I think, speaking, Devin, to your point, the critical path is Google needs something from the city. They need approval of an FAR above 1, which obligates them to have essentially an agreement in place with the school district on the local school, policy.
for elementary school,
For an elementary school.
they have to dedicate land.
So in order for them to get that entitlement, there needs to be something in writing, I think, between the district and Google that they go into the city with. Now, when it actually happens, Google has basically said they are probably going to start development working from the east to the west. So they're going to probably start in Shorebird, work to the west. And, what that threshold is whereby they execute on the dedication of land, the building of the infrastructure out, and the development of the school is open to when are those residential units projected to come online? 6,000, 8,000 units, 4,000 units. It's going to take a while for that to happen, but it could be this, economic cycle. It could be the next economic cycle. If we go into a recession and their development slows down, those residential units, which is the trigger for so there's 2 different things. One is the agreement on the school site, which they need to get the entitlement. The second part is when are they going to, when would they, contribute the funds to build the school and give the land?
And I just want to point out, and I think you, Gene, hit on this, they're developing the other 2 properties first. What they are donating is in the Joaquin property. So their
And
agreement.
Joaquin has more of the affordable, right? Which is going to generate more of the kids.
Right, but the other 2 properties, they plan on developing first. So the Cy West property and the Shorebird is where the rest of the land is, and Joaquin is the other one. So there is this subtle game of we'll get the other properties dedicated, we'll get our entitlements, we'll design everything, and there is no negotiation about what happens in those communities. It's only about what happens in Joaquin.
Yeah, and it's also, how fast is Cy West going to move? How fast is Sobrato going to move? And so from the city's point of view, they're trying to, and then they're looking to the district, when are you guys going to need this school?
Right, because there's nothing that, and so what I was going to say, there's nothing that stops them from developing the other two, which means that they can wait to come up with an agreement later on. And so ideally, it behooves us to have an agreement earlier that identifies where the spot is going to be. And for us, even and Nueva did this and Horace Mann, even if you don't have the student population, to go ahead and do everything you need to do to get the site ready for when you need to build, or at least to have it dedicated so that any development that goes around it, you're not really worried about it. We're not going to go in at the same time that they're going to go in. They're not going to build it for us unless something, a miracle happens or something else. So our process is completely different from theirs. And I would say, just from a standpoint, we need to project for the worst case scenario and the maximum number of students that are going to be there. So we should plan on building a 700 student school on possibly 2.5 acres, because that's the worst case scenario for students. That's also the worst case scenario for the facilities. If we want something different, then we're going to have to revamp our approach to get something different. And we have to do that soon before City Council starts approving their projects. And the first one is already back on the city planning team for them to design. And that's the deal between them and Cy West. They're trying to get that approved as quickly as possible so they can continue to move forward.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, because those are exactly the points we need in order to make a decision. And that helps us to be able to figure out where we stand, what as a board we can do to try and move this process forward. And that explains why I asked Superintendent these questions, because beforehand we had been given those points, but not a real formal update till now.
Right.
But I think
and that's all. I can understand that, and
Right.
it's not an attack on anybody. It's just a matter of trying to figure out the process
Right.
and figure out when we can plug and play.
Right, because you're being asked to make a very hard decision.
Right.
Yeah.
And the question is, do you have enough information to make that decision?
There are still some unknowns, though. The City and Cy West thing, the forced mediation, which was never really likely to work, which the City Council acknowledged, fell apart. So now they're with a city process, but they don't know what they're going to build there. That is far from, at least my understanding is far from being a developed plan, and it's got to go all the way back. So that's really slowing things down, most likely. And that may impact, Google's interest in developing on the east side first. Just how that ends up playing out. And then now the City Council's most recent thing in the context of East Wistman saying no office without housing, and you have to build the housing first. I'm kind of hoping that maybe is a philosophy. I'm not sure. But that approach possibly could end up being extended to North Bayshore. And if we could get ourselves in that equation so that, housing and schools, that'd be really nice. Those may be pipe dreams. But this takes a while. All that said, there's still moving pieces. I'm still interested could we get a larger site closer to that nature area? I don't know if that's possible. They may just say no, but I am interested in moving forward in some context. So if we're looking for straw.
I can
yeah.
speak to, I think at a number of the meetings with Google, we have pushed for the Shorebird area, because, I think, as you guys recognize, there's a lot of natural synergies with the greenways, the corridors, the open space, and they have basically, shut that down. Their argument has been that there's that cross-connect greenway across, I think, Shorebird Parkway or something, that is sort of a district-wide greenway, and so this taps into that greenway. But we recognize, the natural attraction of, the shortboard area. But it's not something that we have not been raising with them.
Any other trustee in terms of feedback to this issue? Because I know Laura spoke to it, I spoke to it, Tamara touched on it, but Devin, Ellen?
Yeah, I'm interested in what we talked about a few minutes ago of them developing 3 or 4 school plan ideas for us to look at moving forward from that viewpoint.
Yeah, I am as well. I mean, I obviously like to go for the larger site, but I think we need to plan for, I don't want to call it the worst possible scenario, but for the smallest possible space that we may be offered. I think there are creative solutions. It sounds like there's a lot we can do in terms of planning open space per level, centralized different services like libraries in the middle of the building or
Right.
between floors, or you have all those creative ideas. I don't need to get
and
into
we
that.
recognize that, show us and then ask us to make a decision.
Yeah,
And
there's
that's
just
fair.
so many unknowns. It gets really hard to
And that's totally fair.
yeah.
So we've been kind of testing different issues. So one of the things, we went back and talked to the city because, Horace Mann, it's all curbside parking, bus loading, pickup, parent pickup, drop off. So we wanted to make sure that the city was going to allow for that, because if we had to do that on the site, huge, spatial implications. And so in our discussions with the city, they basically said, the precise plan recognizes curbside loading, unloading on neighborhood streets, which is what is being proposed on 3 sides of our site. So they said there's a strong policy basis for them to allow for curbside loading, unloading, for buses for field trips, parent pickup, drop off, that kind of activity. And so what they've asked is the city is going to do sort of a comprehensive traffic impact analysis update beginning in the summer. And so they wanted to do is they want to fold the data from this potential school site into their analysis to see what kind of traffic queuing might occur if we are loading, unloading curbside. So there's a lot of sort of wheels in motion to kind of test the feasibility of this site.
So I understand asking for further plans because you're trying to figure out what it looks like. In my mind, and because I have a design background, like I know it's something we can do. I know the pieces still have to be finagled, but I think that it's something we can do, and I think it's something we could do extremely well, almost like a vertical park. But it sounds like there are larger questions about the park space, about the traffic planning, about is this the final site, nailing down agreements with the city, nailing down agreements with Google, finding out when we would get the money from Google if they're contributing. And Dr. Rudolph, is there an option for a joint study session with the city to discuss this?
Or have you brought it up yet?
So President Wilson has emailed Mayor Matichak. I would say that there is now a meeting to discuss whether this is necessary. Maybe that's the best way of putting it. Along with the high school district.
Next Wednesday.
So, and then I just sent off an email to Google and told them that they missed an opportunity today to address concerns that you have. So I think, I do believe there are 23,852 units that have been approved in Mountain View that are in some type of fashion moving forward, not including the Shenandoah project or the 1,972 units that will be coming from NASA that are not even factored into this. So I do think that there is a distinct need for us to have a larger meeting to really lay out the impact of all this that's coming down the pipeline. It's up to the city council and the mayor to agree that it's needed.
Well, if the city is taking over the gateway planning process because the mediation failed, we are part of that gateway area. So I would hope that we can be a part of that process.
Yeah, I reached out to Mayor Matichak a week ago, I believe, and I requested that we plan a joint session between Mountain View Wisdom School District, the City Council, and MVLA. The byproduct of the email communications was let's start sort of a smaller meeting where it's not every member of every body in the room to see what the feasibility of it was my understanding, and possibly hammer out an agenda and try to select a timeline. That was the positive spin I took on it. It wasn't explicitly stated that way. But that will happen, I believe, 1 o'clock next Wednesday. We have it scheduled. So Dr. Rudolph and myself, possibly another board member, I believe Phil Falaise will be there with
Mike Matheson.
yeah, and one other, and possibly
Possibly
another
if you don't-
trustee.
yeah, mhm.
And
Jeff Harding.
Jeff Harding. And then I don't know if outside of Dan Rich and Lisa Matichak, who else would be in the room. But if we pull in an additional member, I would request that she consider bringing in at least 1 or 2 other council people. To me, the issue is we have been, in my mind, doing our due diligence on this problem and this issue. We've hired demographers time and time again. We've been analyzing the situation. We look at all of this in more of a holistic picture. And us as a board, we've had all these wonderful presentations on what's happening, what's going on out there. And so it's very much at the forefront of our minds. And from what I've heard from feedback from various trustees, as well as Dr. Rudolph, and speaking to individual council people, is that they don't have all of that information. And so in my mind, part of that joint session was really about the information piece. You know, people can't make, like we're having a challenging time tonight, we can't make very meaningful, well-informed decisions when we don't have all of the information. And I don't believe that the council does, or even MVLA and their board does as well. So I think having some overarching presentation in a joint session would benefit everyone.
Right.
And then you really see the magnitude of what we're facing in terms of what was the number of units? 10.
Dr. Rudolph has dropped the mic.
I know enough to break the microphone. 23,852 units.
I mean, this
Do we know how many of
substantial.
those are low income? Or I'm sorry, affordable.
Affordable.
Wrong word.
Nope.
No.
Okay.
Well, actually, I would have to go through and
yeah,
list.
just add it all up. It's just that those generate more kids. That's all.
So in terms of moving forward from tonight, it sounds like we're in the process of trying to get the other, we'll call them stakeholders involved in this, into more alignment with each other. And, you know, we don't have entire control over the timeline on that, but we're working on it. We have 3 more meetings this year, 4 more meetings this year. 4 more meetings.
3.
3 in May, 1 in June.
2 and
4. Yeah.
Yeah, we have 4 more meetings. Is it possible that perhaps, it sounds like Trustee Wilson and Trustee Wheeler are interested in seeing more plans generated around this specific site? Is that the takeaway?
Well, that
Yeah,
and
I
me
am
as
as
well.
well.
You
I
are?
think
Okay.
yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
4.
So then maybe that coming back to us, not necessarily in a month, because I don't know if we'll have made the progress we need to in a month, but maybe by June?
Yeah, and I also want to be sure the money we're spending on this.
Yes.
I mean, we've got to
Right.
be fiscally responsible,
Yes.
so we don't want to spend
It-
this bulk of
it's
this
already-
contract on a
It's
site.
part of a
that's not
project, right?
Maybe
It-
the ultimate site.
Yeah. So this is part of the project. I think it's just a readjustment of the timeline.
Yeah, this is sort of the natural next step
Okay.
within the existing scope of our stuff.
Okay, that's helpful because I was worried that we were going to be spending money on
No.
something and we don't even know.
Right.
And this, and this is,
It's basically a sunk cost at this point.
yeah, and this
that
is,
helps that you explain that, because from my lending perspective, I mean, I don't have experience in this,
Sure.
right? I don't know everything. So I'm glad that you're able to explain that step-by-step process to me and to the board,
Sure.
because that makes sense, right?
Right.
And that way we can then do
Yeah,
our due
and,
diligence.
it's only fair for, you're making very significant decisions with huge implications. And, being asked to make those decisions without, a full, range of what ifs is entirely understandable.
this also comes out of a fixed account, right? So this is out of Measure G funds.
Okay.
So this doesn't come out of our operating budget. It's already, but if you look on our budget allocation sheet, you'll see this project is listed as one of the projects on there.
I remember when we approved the contract.
Yes. So
Thank
it's
you
a
for understanding our
not fixed,
hesitation.
but a restricted account.
We recognize that the value of the work that we do is in helping you guys make good decisions. And so whatever we can do to support that, we're more than happy to.
Thank you.
So are we agreeing to do this? Yes?
So we will work to sort of create some iterations of what that looks like. And then I think the other part is not just a meeting, but is really getting some hard answers from Google about whether or not this is the only offer that they have on the table. And I'm seeing a couple people sort of shake heads. I'm assuming that there's a majority that would like for that question to be answered to.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
I also just wanted to thank everybody who
Thank you.
helped, set up the visits and all the presentation materials and stuff, because we've been talking about this for a long time, but until today, when I went to the visits and saw your presentations, it was very amorphous. So I feel like I have a much better sense of what could be done. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
It doesn't appear that we have any additional community comments on this. So are there any additional comments from the board or feedback you'd like to give?
Thank you, everyone. And I apologize for my brashness with Honorable Stephen Nelson, but
Next time I'm gonna.
yes, you should, Madam President. You should
Or I'm just gonna
rein
walk.
me in and you should do that. I would appreciate that. You've got the rights to, buddy.
All right.
All
So
right.
I think we're good.
Adjourn.
Great.
So at 9:05, we'll adjourn the meeting of the Mountain View Wisman School District Board of Trustees. Thank
you
you,
very much.
everyone.